not only are we going to have over the next 60 odd minutes a very interesting discussion, I hope, but you'll also witness, I think, to a Guinness Book of World Records for the world's biggest panel. Because I have done this for many, many years, and I've never seen so many people on one panel. I hope the strongest survive, everybody, because you've got to fight to get a word in edgeways here. So first of all, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for asking me to do this. ENCA is a big supporter not only of this event, but also NAMPU as well, and we really do understand the importance of agriculture in the South African economy. So it's an absolute pleasure to be here, and thank you very much indeed. On a personal note, I just want to thank each and every one of you, including the panel members, for giving me the morning off SONA, the coronavirus,
Great, thank
SAA, Eskom, because if I was back in the newsroom, that's what I would be doing this morning. So it's really nice to have a break and do something completely different. Ladies and gentlemen, the panel has already been introduced to you, just in order of sequence. Johann, it's good to have you with us. Pragnesh, John, Brenda, Bennie, who you've just heard. Kobus, I'm really pleased to make your acquaintance, by the way, from Woolworths, ladies and gentlemen, because I have now found out why I am paying so much for avocado pears. And if I achieve nothing else today, I have achieved something very important in my life. And Jeff Every as well, thank you very much for joining us. The title of the panel discussion this morning is Capital and Growth. I, with your permission, am going to change the title immediately, and I'm going to simply call it The Future, because without capital and growth, I would suggest to you that your industry is dead in the water. So let's look at where this industry is now going. Folks, just by way of the way in which I like to do these things, I have been chairing panel discussions. I've been a broadcaster for over 30 years. There are two things that define a broadcaster. One is that I have the biggest ego of all of you in this room, okay? And because of that, I love the sound of my own voice, okay? But it's not about me. It's about the panel, and it's mostly about you. So I know that we do have roving microphones. The way I like to do it is if you feel the need to interject, put up your hand, shout Jeremy or hey you or fat man or whatever you want to say, and I will recognize you, and we can interact with the panel. I don't think it works if we discuss everything and then we have a Q&A session right at the end, so dive in immediately. So, John, I'm going to start with you if I may, and it's good to see you again. It's all very well to talk about the intersect between capital and growth, but let's get your perspective first of all as to where, if at all, you see growth potential in the agri sector.
Yes, thanks, Jeremy. I'll try and make it a bit shorter than a minute or 30 seconds, as Bruce was doing just now. We must first.
Let me just say, Bruce Whitfield doesn't know what he's doing, okay? These are my rules now, okay?
I think we must first look at the trend where we come from in agriculture. And if you look at the past 20 years, agriculture has been growing at roughly 1.8, 1.7% per annum over that period. Obviously, agriculture, its growth is always very cyclical depending on the weather conditions, etc. But if you take that long-term average, we're growing at roughly 1.7, 1.8%. That is too low, but there still has been positive growth and investment in the sector. We've seen that the investment has tapered off a little bit in the last few years, a combination of policy uncertainty, drought, and then also access to markets, because we are a net exporter and probably 70% of our value chains we are net exporter of. So we've got to be globally competitive and we've got to access those markets. But there is still great opportunity to grow. But we need a change in the policy environment, the enabling environment, the ecosystem that we call the food value chain. And government must bring us greater policy certainty. We need to have innovative financing mechanisms. That's part of what Bennie was saying earlier.
Which we will get into.
Yes. Yep. So if you create the right environment, you will get investment, you'll get growth, you'll get jobs. Jobs is a lag indicator. And then that cycle must just keep on going. So we remain bullish. if we can get the cooperation with government, and we're busy with that. We're busy with a master plan for agriculture. The President referred to that in the SONA. We're very much part of that, leading that process, in fact, from the agriculture and agro-processing sector.
And I do want to get into that master plan a little bit later. Brenda, Tlhabane, do you feel a little outnumbered here? There's too much testosterone on this stage, eh?
You read my mind.
Really, hey?
It's not only about me being the only female. I mean, throughout a lot of panels, there's just been one or two women. And the youth component, I think there's the neglected part in terms of the panel selection. And yeah.
Youth component is important because what I'm seeing, and you can give her a round of applause for that, because what I'm seeing is white hair, no hair, white hair, grey hair with little hair, no hair, and grey hair. And that's also, it's also
that's
about,
what innovation
it's about new,
talks
it's about innovation
it's about
in the industry.
new market entrants, and the target market is the youth, which are not really integrated into the whole structure.
Brenda, let's talk about this phrase that I've heard for the last 10 years. Policy uncertainty in the agri sector. What's your understanding of that, and how does that impede the growth potential that Dr. John Purchase was talking about?
From my side, as someone who started in the sector about 10 years ago, one of the main challenges that I'll come back to your question in terms of the policy uncertainty. One has to look at the whole value chain, the whole ecosystem of what needs to be corrected in the sector. Yes, there needs to be a reform in terms of the policy of the whole agricultural outlook. But for me, it starts with the securitization of the land tenure, which ultimately equates to whether I'm able to get finance or not. And until such time we have those discussions about the EWC and where is its place in the sector in terms of economic growth, then we'll always be dealing with the policy uncertainty issues. Because you have one side being content and another side of black players.
So
not being
until the
accommodated.
tricky issue of distribution
Yes.
is dealt with, you are like a flywheel that's spinning.
That's all we're going to do. We need to sort out the policy in terms of the growth component, in terms of the land. The land issue is still, it's a burning debate that will ultimately, if we can get it right, all the other issues will fall into place.
Jeff Every from Amadlelo Agri, do you believe that that's the single biggest impediment? And do you believe that there is enough will to facilitate the change? Because it's all very well having this master plan that John spoke about, but unless you get the land question sorted, we're all wasting our time here.
No, I don't agree with that. I think, firstly, we need to stop pussyfooting around nation-critical issues. Secondly, somebody ought to explain to government, you can't fly to Cape Town and Durban at the same time. Worse still if you're trying to fly SAA. So we can't go north and south at the same time. You've got to make a decision. The problem that we're sitting with down at where we are is we've got plenty of land, and it's in black hands, but it's doing nothing in the space that I operate in. So you can see me, I'm different to all of these guys. I've got short sleeves, which means I actually do some work, and I've got jeans and tackies. So I'm the guy who's on the receiving end of policy or lack of policy, receiving end of supposed funding or lack of funding. So my viewpoint, and we operate in the black communal space almost exclusively. We have a lot of young, trained black managers who can very easily step in and run a farm as good as any white commercial farmer in South Africa. The problem is we can't get there. The problem there is that we're sitting in a situation where we have a socialist environment where the state wants to own the land, and the banking sector is in a title-driven environment. So if you don't have a title deed, and you don't get funding, period. So this is trying to go to Cape Town and Durban at the same time. You can't do that. So my view is it's very simple. we need to come up with a solution to either you title the land and use the current banking system, or you come up with a new way of funding socialist state-owned land and unlock the value of that land, unlock the potential of that land, unlock employment, unlock opportunities for black farmers.
So, to the rest of the panel members, I will get to you in a moment. But Brenda, I have noticed you rolling your eyes. I'm absolutely sure that you want to respond to that.
Yes, Jeff is, when he started his statement, he says he disagrees with me. But he went back and says secure tenure of the land. I mean, that's the only thing in the agricultural sector that talks to securitization, your access to finance, without security of permission to occupy that land. The current system does not allow new entrants to get access to finance. So how do you start saying about I'm going to participate in the mainstream if I do not have the basic thing which talks to the secure tenure? So that's why I'm saying we'll forever sit in one panel, one conference after the other, until such time we sort out the land issue and understand that our banking model currently is not designed in a way where it's supposed to bring development in the sector. So until we get that reform in the whole banking system, we will never yield any results when we talk about development and growth and trends in the sector.
Pragnesh Desai, you're the Chief Executive Officer of Galileo Asset Managers. What I've heard is there's something wrong with the funding model. Would you like to weigh in on that?
Thanks, Jeremy. Yeah. So I think I'm probably here because in my previous life, maybe for my sins, I was a banker, and at the interface where passion meets the credit head. And it's important to understand, when we talk about funding, what is required to, first of all, satisfy somebody that you can get access to it. We'll come to the cost of it, pricing, that's a different discussion. The first thing we've got to accept is that bankers are not farmers, right? And people who sit on the credit committees and the decision makers of credit committees have maybe been on a farm. If there's a kind of a visit that somebody has twisted their arm, let's go and see that farm and then you can understand what's going on. But they've not, they're not farmers per se.
It's not a lived reality.
That's right. So what they have in front of them is a whole bunch, a file thick like this of a credit application, and kind of you've got to make your assessment and judgment on that. Surrounding that is all kinds of noise, obviously. Well, what's going to happen to land? What's going to happen to water? Diseases. So if you break all of that down, right? So at the level of a farm is actually a collection of assets, and we need to understand that. So one is land, right? So does that have title? Does it not have title? Does it have a lease right? But is it tradable? Can we convert that to a finance number?
Do you see that as big a stumbling block as Brenda Tlhabane does?
It's definitely right up there in terms of its importance. But, for example, there is situations where people are buying farmland and then leasing it back to farmers. And, you can certainly bank that lease because, again, there's a value behind it. So ownership is not everything, but can we treat the farmland, the land itself, as an asset? And we've got to get to that. Or if you take water rights, so water right is actually also an asset because the supply of water can be charged, right? Similarly, if you look at the production biological process, converting seed to plants, that's insurable, right? So is there an insurance value to that? Can that be traded? So ultimately, a farm is a collection of assets and kind of needs to be treated that way or in each of those components. What is the value of each of those things? And then you satisfy the credit manager. He can understand what kind of losses or profits he's facing at each component and then make a decision.
Oh, so that sounds very methodical to me. How do you unlock that, though? How do you simplify that process?
Simplification.
Is it back to policy uncertainty?
Well, I wouldn't say so. So obviously policy uncertainties, then I don't want to downplay it. But first of all, what kind of guidance are we giving farmers and their advisors? When they want to raise funding from banks, how much information are they sharing? How much data is there? How are you convincing the banks that you've reduced the potential for surprises? Right? So let's just take the last drought, right? So I don't think anyone expected that the drought would be over consecutive years, right? So we've all been used to that you can have drought one year and then it rains the other year, and then again it will rain and then again there's a drought. But I certainly, when I was in banking at that time, you kind of felt surprised. And avoiding surprise is the first duty of credit. So we've just got to be very clear with our information, present it well, and ultimately I think you should get a good decision.
Which leads me to you, Bennie. How do you respond to that, and what information do you need in order to facilitate a smoother process for the agricultural community?
Jeremy,
If you agree with him.
maybe just two things. If all bankers were sinners in the past, we should all be bankers. So I don't see working in a bank as some sort of a punishment for something that did in the past. And then, Jeff, we do real work. It's just in a more comfortable environment. Look, the banks are in the business of taking risk. And unfortunately, in the agricultural space, there are a number of uncertainties. Let's park the policy uncertainty for now. I'm not a politician, but our biggest two risks that we're exposed to in the agricultural space, we have no control over. We can't control the weather, and we can't control commodity prices. And that plays a key part. And the moment that you're exposed to that level of risk and there's little certainty, banks will default back to what they do well. They look at collateral values, and that goes back to the discussion about land tenure and can we convert something that's not land tenure into some sort of a value. And then the second part is a look at cash flow and predictability of cash flows. That's the simple two matrices that banks use to. So, and we have to find ways to mitigate the risks that's associated with land tenure and predictability of cash flows. Land tenure, I don't think in South Africa, the land reform debate or land distribution debate will go away in my life. And I still look around the table, I may be the youngest. And maybe, you never know. But I don't think it will go away.
Bennie, don't go there with age. You're just upsetting everybody.
So but the point being is that if we wait for absolute policy certainty on land and land tenure issues, we'll wait forever. So we have to find alternative ways to. And if we then look at mitigating risk, we then into how do we mitigate the risk that can make cash flows more predictable? And then you're into building value chains that typically starts with availability of water, because that's clearly a key aspect in the agricultural space, and understanding how you can have see-through unpredictability of cash flows. And with value chains, if you look at the simple agricultural value chain, it clearly has to be land. You need infrastructure, including access to water. You need some form of a financial support. You need skills and so forth, and you need access to a distribution channel. So as a bank, if I have access and line of sight to all of these components, I'm in a much better position to decide whether I want to take on or don't want to take on the risk. Jeff,
So how do you achieve that line of sight that you're talking about?
that's to
What would make it, obviously it's better incoming data.
Yeah.
How do you source that?
So and that's where there are a lot of partners and partnerships required to achieve that. If we expect banks to play the role as catalysts for the entire value chain, it's very difficult to expect a bank to achieve that. And it starts with support programs, government support programs. It starts with certainty on access to water. So if I've got the ability to understand what input provider supports which farmer, which the farmer delivers to which storage facility, the storage facility to which processing plant, the processing plant to which wholesale and retailer. I've got line of sight of the entire value chain. So I've got the ability to have much more certainty. And in that, there's a lot of, we're discussing technology at this event, there's a lot of technology components that can play a part. If we're going to be, from a bank perspective, reactive in managing risk, so we only basically know what's happening on our farm once a year, well, clearly that's too late. So we have to become more proactive in understanding what are the conditions of the crops and the commodities, what progress have been made or not been made, and with that level of certainty, we'll be in a much better ability to predict.
And Johann Barnard, Chief Digital Officer at Agri Group Holdings, part of your job, in fact, not part of your job, your entire job, is to make sure that that data that Bennie van Rooy is referring to is supplied optimally. Is that a problem? Could you be doing more in that respect to strip out the uncertainty and the risk that all of them have spoken about?
I think, gentlemen, definitely from my side and from an agricultural environment, I fully support Bennie's notion on that, because if you look at the power of data at this point in time, data is the new oil. We all know that. And if I may share some of the experiences that I've incurred over the past 5 years in the Agri environment, where the agricultural sector is definitely a risky environment, that really makes sense to get your data sets structured and financed and sort of articulated in a way that makes sense. So if we started back 5 years ago with our own data set, it definitely gives you some context in terms of how this whole evolvement of a digital ecosystem can mitigate risk and also supply growth opportunities. Specifically in our environment, we've seen some growth opportunities within that environment of growing our financial services sector book from 1.7 billion to 14 billion. So that's exponential growth that data and the mitigating and also the growth opportunities for data has actually unlocked for the value proposition of the agriculture.
So, Kobus Pienaar, Technical Manager, Food and Farming for the Future at Woolies. You're right at the end of the value chain. The debate that you've heard so far, how does that impact on the ability of farmers to get the job done and ultimately for your organization to distribute optimally?
Yes, Jeremy, on our side is we know nothing about farming, but our entire business is built on farming. We can't do any business without our farmers. And there's a number of uncertainties in the value chain. Most of the literature, when you open it up, put the value chain in blocks. It's the input supplier block, farmer block, it's the distributor, it's the processor, it's us at the retail. I think it's time that we put it in one block, that all the players, stakeholders in the value chain work together to get to a solution. We agree that waiting for policy change, it might come too late for us as a business. That's why we've 10 years ago started with the Farming for the Future program, because not only small-scale farmers were in trouble, also our commercial farmers were in trouble. And us as the smallest retailer in South Africa, who is aiming for the biggest quality or the best quality, makes it even more difficult when you put into the pot climate change, inputs that's prices soaring, the skills of farmers to deliver that quality product, the challenges on food safety. You can just think about the listeria, avian flu in the animal part, and not even talk about the coronavirus that's happening now. So there's a lot of challenges that we face. And if we look at the driver of this whole value chain, it's the consumer. Consumer behavior changed the whole value chain. If they want the cheapest price at their own convenience, delivered for free at their home, then the farmer is going to suffer in their price. So if consumers, and I'm talking about experience from our consumers, we do a massive amount of customer research. And for us to survive as a company, because we're in a bit of a niche market, and it's quite a risky place to be in terms of business, because we sell food on trust. That's what they ask us to do. We ask a number of questions. It's the sustainability questionnaire that's well known. And the top 6 that came out in the same ratio is that first, they want to know, is the food safe? Our customers. Secondly, is the food nutritious? Is there enough nutrition in it? Thirdly, is it a fair price? So price is not number one. Fourthly, then it only comes, what about the farmer? And then fifthly, what about the animals in the animal welfare side of it? So the farmer is not on top of mind of consumers. So if consumers drive low prices, it's playing down to the value chain. And that is the challenge we sit with. We also can't sell a bag of potatoes at 100 rand a bag in the store. Nobody's going to buy it. Then they switch to alternatives. So it is a massive challenge, and I think the brokenness of the food chain or the value chain in South Africa, it is because the different stakeholders place in different places, and we don't talk to one another.
So, John Purchase, let's come back to you. How do you corral all of that in one direction, or is it simply impossible to do?
Yes, Jeremy, just the most important thing, it's about globally competitive value chains, because globally competitive value chains provide food security. And we must provide safe, affordable, and nutritious food because that's what the consumer wants. How do we do that?
Which we are unable to do.
No. I disagree a little bit. We actually, in South Africa, have a really good agro-food, agro-beverage, agro-fiber system. It's an asset. We are a net exporter. We have national food security of the best in the world. Where we do fail in terms of our food security is our household food security, because 20% of our population cannot afford the food, even though our food is of the cheapest in the world. And you can go and check. I travel a bit, and you can.
So that's not an agri issue. It's a broader policy issue.
That's not.
It's not an agri issue as much as a broader macro.
That's a socio-economic, broader socio-economic issue. Exactly the point. I do agree, though, that what we must do is to make our value chains look where the deficiencies in our value chains are, because they're not perfect, and there I agree. Go and look where we can improve those efficiencies to ensure that competitiveness. This is exactly what we're trying to do with the master plan, is to build that compact between business and government and labor. And this is what the president is all about in his SONA and in his investment forum. He reiterated it there. And what we're trying to do is to ensure that all those value chains, and in agriculture, there are many, there are over 50. Some of the big ones, like beef and maize, etc., but there's some small ones, like the nuts industries, etc., is to take each value chain, deep dive into that value chain, and one of the partners, BFAP already, they've been appointed to do that research for us, and then on the basis of that, draw up a master plan to address exactly what he was pointing at, to get to those ecosystems, to make them efficient. Government have a big role to play in the policy area, but they also have a big role to play in logistics, electricity supply, the ports, roads and railway, etc. So, because logistics is a big component of the whole cost in your value chain. So you must have these partnerships between private sector, business, and then labor obviously is also important in the sector. So this is what it's all about. I think it's the right way to go about it. Yes, there's going to be a bit of to and fro, and there's going to be a bit of consensus seeking. But if we can get this right, we will have our value chains even more globally competitive. Wandile put out a great piece last week in Daily Maverick on the trade issue in South Africa. We export roughly just over generally $10 billion worth of agricultural products, and we import about $6 billion. Now, it came down last year because of the headwinds we had in agriculture, the droughts and perhaps some policy uncertainty, electricity. It definitely knocks agriculture to the load shedding, etc. But if we can get that right, and we already feel that, and we were in a recession in agriculture. But we believe with this year, with the good rains, and both in the southern areas, Western Cape, but also in the maize-producing areas, we could even have a very positive growth in agriculture. So we think it's just a once-off, and that we can start growing again. So
beyond the static 1.7% that you were talking about.
So our exports dropped about 8.8% year on year from 2018 to 2019. But we think that this will turn around again in 2020. So we're not all negative about this. There are things to fix. This is why we're doing the master plan. Definitely, that's why Durban Harbour, the overall on Durban Port, was highlighted very specifically by the President, because to get our fruit exports out, especially citrus, and we export 20 billion rands worth of citrus every year now, to get that out is a huge constraint or a huge problem through Durban. So these are the type of things that we need to address in the value chain to make them more efficient.
And you're suggesting that some of those are already addressed. So, Jeff, back to you now. Do you share the optimism that Dr. Purchase is articulating today? And where would you see the potential to make improvements in the efficiencies in the value chain?
I think we've got a two-tier system in our country because of our Gini coefficient challenges that we have. We've got a sophisticated market, that the Woolies market, the sort of place that I don't go to, is too expensive. So. And then at the other end of the
Kobus, so do you want to swap seats? I'm happy if you want.
Keep your enemy close.
And then the flip side of the scale is you go to rural, former homeland areas where definitely they're not going to go to Woolies. They're not even going to go to the local supermarket because that's tough on them. And generally the way it's done there is we will sell milk in your container at 6 Rand, whereas if you want to go to the supermarket, you're going to buy the same liter of milk for 11 Rand. So we must remember that. We can't keep just focusing on the top end of this thing. We need to, there are 10 million unemployed people in our country. They pose to me a massive socio-political risk to the future of South Africa, so we need to take that into account. So I think what's missing for me is we can have first world regulations and everything else, and yes, the food has to be safe right up at the top there, but there's a bit of innovation needed around that as to how do we get food to those that can't afford really expensive food. So I agree, we compete with the best in the world with our value chains, except for some reason not with Polish milk. Okay, so I'm still going to find out why. Because that gets imported here cheaper than I can produce it, so that's worrying me. But generally speaking, we compete with the best in the world. I'm happy with that. But I'm saying the challenge for us in South Africa is that we've got to service the bottom end of the market at a price that they can afford to pay.
So, Brenda, Tlhabane, pick that up. How do you incorporate that sector into the value chain that John Purchase is referring to? Because it's all very well for us to sit in a nice air-conditioned conference center because we're all plugged into the top end of the value chain, but the disconnect, as Jeff rightly mentions, is immense.
Where we are currently, I guess it's the approach of the silo that has been done over the generations. We need now to start moving forward to look at the whole ecosystem as food systems, where you talk about water, land, agriculture, energy, and right in the middle now we're dealing with climate change. So it's a whole holistic nexus kind of an approach that will get us out of the mud that we're in. And secondly, it's about industrialization, where not much, we do produce, but for a limited or maybe the niche market. What about those that are right at the bottom end of the chain who do not have access to food, or about 55% of our population?
That's the point that Jeff is raising.
Yeah, 55% of our population is not guaranteed a meal every day. So for me, there's a new growth area that we need to focus on. But we can't achieve that if we keep small-scale producers disconnected from the system. So it's another element that we need to cultivate. Those that farmers are the most food insecure part of the community. We produce food, yet we don't have access to that. What will that equate to? Those are questions we need to start asking ourselves. And also, what's the best model that we need to adopt? We need to now start broadening our thinking into which countries we had the similar challenges, and what did they do in order for them to get out of that rut. The Russians did try the model, it failed. Is it time now where we need to look at the Asian tigers approach, where they said industrialize quickly to get quick results? So I think it's the whole nexus approach and the best model that we can incorporate in terms of economic growth that will ultimately talk to the agricultural growth opportunities and risk mitigation in order for keeping the status quo.
Let's go back to the financial services industry then. John, I'll come to you right now. Pragnesh, let me bring you back in though. Small-scale producers. With small-scale producers comes greater risk often. How do you bring them into that nexus that, that Brenda is referring to?
So, in terms
because you essentially have no choice here.
Yeah, well, so, I mean, the first thing we may also assume is that small-scale farmers may probably not have title to the land. Then it's a case of, at the very least, we need to be aware, or what bankers would tend to look at is, at least do they have committed contracts where they can sell their produce? Because we need to figure out where is the cash going to come from. Now, I don't know if it exists in South Africa, but I mean, I've kind of looked at India before, and they have lots of small-scale farmers. In fact, they have very few big commercial farmers like you have in South Africa. And almost in every state or every district, there is, there are government agencies that buy whatever crops that these farmers have grown. And I don't know to what extent that is here, but it's probably something that we need to look at. So, for all crops that form part of what we would call food security, so that's maize or rice or wheat, and to the extent that small-scale farmers, know how to grow it, but they kind of don't know where to sell it formally, then, as long as that arrangement is placed, I think bankers could look at financing that sort of thing on a kind of semi-secured basis.
But why don't they, Bennie? Because Pragnesh has just talked about them not having the contracts.
See,
and that to me, I mean,
it's back.
I'm a babe in the woods here in your industry, but it seems to me that if you don't have the contracts, you don't have the wherewithal to sell.
Maybe we should ask Kobus the question. But the reality is that we need to look at, from a bank perspective, at predictability of revenue. So if we have a business case, and TP and Chocho, when he was CEO at the Land Bank, had this beautiful comparison of Farmer A and Farmer B. Farmer A is a mega farmer, 3 generations of track record, predictability of revenues, audited financial statements, security, all the boxes can be ticked. Farmer B is a smallholder farmer in the Eastern Cape. No audited financial statements, no guaranteed off-take agreements, no track record of agricultural production, yet it is somebody with ambition to become a farmer. So we are presented with applications from Farmer B, and we need to understand that funding is a critical element in the agricultural space, because the timeline between incurring input costs and generating revenue differs significantly. I mean, if you just take a grain example, we plant in October, November, or December, and we harvest when the frost starts, and farmers only generate their revenue at that stage. So you need to be funded through the working capital cycle to incur input costs and. Now, if I don't have the ability as a bank to have some clarity and certainty on the quality of the off-take agreements that are in place, it's very difficult to fund something like that. So that's where we've discussed the notion of a value chain. If we can get, and it's a challenge that we need to put out to the retailers. How can retailers, or what do retailers need to have sufficient clarity on aggregation and quality control to enable them to offer guaranteed, or to provide guaranteed off-take agreements to farmers? If that's in place and there's that certainty, and I know that Farmer B Woolworths will buy X kilogram of potatoes at that price, and enable Farmer B to deliver that, it's a much easier way to fund.
And I understand your argument, but are you trying hard enough when it comes to Farmer B? Because I would suggest to you that you almost have an ethical responsibility now to try a little harder.
There's no choice, to be quite frank, because we have to increase the number of commercial farmers in South Africa. If we just look how skewed the numbers are, I mean, I'm sure John will know the numbers by heart, but something like 200,000 small-scale farmers, 2 million subsistence farmers.
We're on the same page. My question to you is, and I'm not saying you personally, I'm saying
fortunately not.
The people that control the access to capital. Are you trying hard enough?
We are, and I mean that, well, are we trying hard enough? Clearly not, because we're not getting the results. And it's much easier then to default back to funding Farmer A because there's a low risk.
Precisely.
And
That's the problem, isn't it, Brenda?
It is a huge problem because private finance is expensive for small-scale producers or new entrants in the market. How do we get past that level where I love the fact that the generational issue has been addressed. You find my competitor having a backup of 7 generations of the strength in terms of getting access to finance. I'm the first generational farmer. So where does that leave me? I still need to be overburdened with all this. I need to find my feet in order to farm sustainably. I need to find my feet in order to make sure that we reach the policy makers in terms of making it an environment, to make the environment enabling enough for us to participate in the economic mainstream. The third issue, climate change. Huge cost of technology and innovation. Number 5 would be guaranteed markets. The retailers do not want to give us those off-takers until such time that they know that we can produce quality. Another element is how does one start to unlock value out of the farming? There is no way. Currently, we do not have a bank that we can say it has a developmental mandate to accommodate small-scale farmers or new entrants or aspiring farmers. Everyone else tells about you have to be secured enough. I don't have that privilege currently to take a call and call the manager to say I need access to 5 million. Even if I have land and secure right to that land.
But let me bring Johann back into this. There's a David and Goliath analogy here.
Yes.
Because the smaller farmer does have the advantage of being more adept, a little bit more nimble, the ability to turn quicker. And that would be predicated on the optimal use of technology, am I right? Is the availability to that technology good enough? And are smaller farmers using it critically and efficiently?
I think, Jeremy, definitely from my perspective, I think we're fortunate enough to live in the 4th industrial revolution, almost moving from a data scarcity to a data abundancy environment itself. And I think definitely the opportunities for small-scale farmers to also embrace technology might not be as effective as within the commercial farmers.
That's my question. So we all know that 4IR is here, it's a reality, it's being used by big agribusiness, but why are smaller farmers not using that more efficiently in order to break into that value chain that John was talking about?
I think it might be a capital.
Cost? What is it?
Yeah, absolutely. From my perspective, I think definitely the lack of capital within that environment, because we know, although the IoT devices of nowadays are becoming more cheaper as we go along this journey, it's still at a price level, I think, where we could almost like think about getting a sponsorship going for the small-scale farmer to actually embrace that environment, to actually start participating in the economy.
John?
Yes,
So hang on, before we go on, I mean, we've got this, what was it, this 25 billion rand over 10 years that AGDA is going to put into the industry. And how much of that is going to be used on technology?
Yes. I just want to make the point, I'm going to come back to that, is this master plan, while the premise is the competitive value chains, it's an inclusive growth strategy. In other words, to also bring the developing farmer into the process.
Yeah,
that is a very strong overarching component of this. And the issue is, how do we do it? Because that's where we're battling. The commercial sector, finance in the commercial sector, with all due respect, works pretty well. It's how do we get the finance and the commercial or the smallholder farmers that value unlocked. I'm going to use an example of the beef industry. 42% of the beef herd in South Africa is in black hands.
Yes.
It's in the communal areas.
Yes.
Former Transkei, KZN, Limpopo, that's what Wandile was referring to. Only 5% of that gets into the commercial value chain. So we haven't got the right husbandry practices to get those and to unlock that value on the export market. So now we've become a net exporter of beef just in the last 3-4 years into China and into various other countries. If we can get the system, the ecosystem, value system, chain right through LITS, that's livestock identification and traceability system, and that's where you need technology, but also into those communal areas, because then you can stop the spread of foot and mouth disease, you can add value in terms of what your consumer wants, and this is what we need. We need a rural development strategy based on an e-commerce strategy. I happened to be in China in June last year. China have used an e-commerce strategy for rural development. And if you look at what Alibaba does, it supports over 10 million SMMEs in China, all little small producers. It just creates a platform for them to produce and then to distribute. Its mission is to make it easy to do business anywhere. Just that. Make it easy to do business anywhere. I think the technology allows us that to do it, just the cell phone. And I think what we need is a good development strategy. I think Rolf Meyer's initiative with AGDA is a step in the right direction. I hope we can unlock that 25 billion that he says that they can unlock. Certainly, the agribusinesses, I think the finance sector, even all the role players will want to contribute to that. The aggregation models are very important because we must create access to the global markets. So you have a number of companies like Beefmaster, Cernic in the beef industry. There are others, Sparta. But if you also look at Westphalia in the avocado production for smallholders, you look at citrus, there are over 80 black citrus farmers already in the export market working through platforms like Sunday's River Citrus Company. So those aggregation, I'm sure Agri have very similar models. Those aggregation models are incredibly important to train the people, get the skills going, get the finance going, get the quality that the Woolworths and those guys want to get that out. And if we can get that integration right and managed properly through the master plan, I think that ties it up, and that's where we should be going.
Yeah. Kobus, what role do you play in this integration that John is talking about?
See,
How much pressure can you bring to bear?
Yeah. I've been appointed at Woolworths. I'm the only boertjie in Cape Town in that office. All the other guys are financial people. But Woolworths saw that if we don't get involved...
Do they dress differently to you? They wear suits and you...
They wear suits. I also wanted to wear one of these, but I thought I'll feel out of place. Is that if we don't get involved right to source, we'll never understand the challenges. If you just sit and purchase or buy products, you'll never understand. So my role at Woolworths is to work right at source, at farm level, where the rubber hits the road. And that is where all our food comes from. And us not be able to give small-scale growers a program or a letter of intent or what you always want to name it, is that it's uncertainty, and uncertainty brings fear. And the fear in Woolworths...
Uncertainty of what? What are you scared
of? Of not having a product at the requirements we want. If we don't have that, I've got empty shelves. And I don't think we'll have for many years a customer base if we have empty shelves every day. So, and that's why I'm hoping that we can work together with a master plan, that we get involved right through to the end and maybe take more risks and show intent. I think the time of just talking is gone. What we've tried to do is to almost force our commercial farmers, who's got a track record, to take a small-scale grower on board as a mentor, to give that small-scale grower a track record. And the track record in the Woolworths perspective is that we know they can supply product.
Why can't you put pressure as a premier retailer on that bigger farmer to do that?
Well, we've got a system which we call a supplier scorecard. And we look at many aspects of the performance of that supplier. And one of them is the involvement in small-scale growers in that environment or that region where they farm. So it's one of the aspects we look at. And if
just one though, but I mean, I'm sure that urgency to get product to shelf is more important than whether a big farmer is mentoring a small farmer. So it's nice to have on paper, but it doesn't really count.
You're absolutely right. Absolutely right. That's why I say is that the time to act and stop talking is now here. So and that's why we pledge for all the stakeholders in the value chain. We're very good on buying a product and putting it on shelf. but we do not have all the skills to go right down to the source.
Jeff, you know what we're also very good at in this country? Forming master plans. And let me tell you what we're also good at. If we don't have a master plan, then we'll have a task team. And if we don't have a task team, do you know what we'll have then? We'll have a commission of inquiry.
Yeah.
Okay? And to me, it's back to that original analogy that I made at the beginning of our conversation about this flywheel that keeps on spinning. Do you take solace from this master plan that Dr. Purchase is seemingly very excited about?
I think if he drives it, yes, I do. If government were driving it, I wouldn't bother to worry about it. So I think positively there's firstly a heart change at grassroots level where we operate. Not all the people, but there are pockets of heart change.
How does that manifest?
Well, a lot of the bigger operators are doing exactly what John's saying. They're taking on board the aggregation challenges of supplying woolies with whatever they want. I mean, the analogy I use is you don't build a shopping mall if you don't have an anchor tenant. We try to build agri parks without anchor tenants. You can't build an agri park for small-scale producers. You build an agri park. But you have operators in that agri park who are prepared, who are the experienced, know what they're doing, and they will help the young people and the small-scale farmers to come alongside. If we don't do it like it, it's not going to work. And there are lots and lots of positive messages out there. You can go to SRCC, Sundays River. You can go to PALS in Cape Town. We're doing the same thing. ZZ2 are doing the same thing. So it's starting. People might look at it and say, yes, but it's not perfect, but it doesn't matter. At least it's been started. You can perfect it as you go along. But it's no good exactly having a master plan and not one attempt to do this has actually been started at grassroots. So there are lots of attempts at grassroots to get this going, and it is working. It's not perfect, but it is working. Yes, there are issues with people worrying about exploitation and all of that, but we can't carry on as a country as an us and them country. We farmers, and it's a continuum. For me, it's small scale to large scale, but they're all in one pot. If you start to put them in different pots, it's difficult. Yes, we can turn around through that same model, and we had a successful model, incidentally, of that was put through Land Bank through to the co-ops to fund small scale farmers, and we used it extensively in the former homeland areas, and then for whatever reason, it was very successful. So obviously in South Africa, when that happened, you stopped doing it. So that was a challenge for us because it left a hole, and we haven't filled that hole yet. We're still talking about blended financing. The bottom line is that a black farmer can't access funding in South Africa. End of story. But to come back to you, we're starting to break this stuff out. You know, we listened, when it was the day before yesterday, to the Netherlands. I was in Ireland looking at their dairy industry a year back. Those countries, it's the farmer, the researcher, and the government against the world. In this country, it's everybody against everybody in the country. So we're internally focused. They're externally focused. If we change our attitude, and we all work together so that our country prospers, instead of having silos and fighting and trying to legislate at times a small-scale model that probably economically cannot possibly work because it's politically legislated instead of practically and economically viable.
So, Brenda, it can't be legislated. It's got to happen more organically, is what I think I'm hearing Jeff say. Do you accept his statement that we're seeing a change of heart, albeit fairly slowly?
I'll say yes and no. Change of heart starts with action. You don't just say, I'm doing this if your actions reflect something else. It goes down, everyone is up in arms when black people talk about the land issue, the expropriation without compensation. where do we start? We get excited when one says, I'm willing to develop you, I'm willing to include you into the economic mainstream, yet I'm not giving you the most basic enabler, which is the land. Secondly, the structure of the whole banking system that needs to be re-looked at, the rural finance component of securing those land parcels. When you go to deep rural areas, no one has a PTO, permission to occupy that land. Unlike other African countries, where one can actually just farm at any piece or any land parcel. There's a system that has been designed to accommodate that small-scale producer. But in our country, you need secure title of tenure, you need secured market guaranteed income. No one is willing to take the risk in our country. So, and we need to start having those debates to say what needs to be corrected. But this whole thing of just saying, yes, I'm doing something, let's start now to massify that kind of development in terms of new entrants, aspirant farmers, small-scale producers. So we need to start seeing action that talks to, I want to do this, but if nothing is being done.
Pragnesh, weigh in here. How do you absorb that? Sounds like a complete and utter mess to me. There might be pockets of a change of heart, but that doesn't fill me with much optimism. Does it fill you?
Well, so it's probably unfair to ask commercial banks, and I'm not one, but I can certainly. So I don't have a stake in what I'm about to say, but.
This is the third time you've distanced yourself from the bank. We get it, okay? We understand.
But it's unfair to expect them to still make a profit and kind of lend in a way that kind of increases their losses. I mean, just to put it in perspective, I think in agricultural lending, between the cost of funds and what the average farmer, and that includes commercial farmers and everyone pays, it's about 2% margin. Your credit losses should not exceed that. Otherwise, you're wasting time as a bank and you're clearly going to be unprofitable. So there's no doubt that, therefore, some kind of interest subsidization needs to come in. Now, you've had this in the country before. I think many years ago, there was something called Mafisa. I mean, the terms were absolutely fantastic to kind of the what we would call the originator of loans. He would be granted that finance at 1%, and he was allowed to charge 7%. 8% at that time was prime minus 1.25 or something. Why didn't that model work, right? I don't think anyone was even asking for security.
So, Bennie, what prevents movement in the change of the funding model? How do you take a step?
Two questions. I mean, we have to understand that the agricultural lending portfolios in commercial banks, I'm excluding Grow Bank because we are a commercial agricultural bank, is a tiny component of their total portfolios. The total agricultural debt in South Africa at this stage is about 180 billion rand. The commercial bank's mortgage loan portfolios exceed that. So from a risk appetite perspective, if you're exposed to a sector where there are so many risks, and from a commercial banking perspective, clearly you would rather want to invest your funding when there's more certainty. So, and by only providing land and funding, if we're going to do that and expect farmers to be successful, I mean, we might just as well donate money into the Kimberley hole at this stage. It's not going to work. And we've made reference to the notion of value chains. We have to be able to complete the value chains that supports and enables the farmers to become successful. Only giving land and funding is not going to
support
work.
From whom?
Support from, and that's where government needs to play a part. You need loss absorption capability. And that's the WFF facility that the Land Bank had that was successful was a government grant facility that enabled the Land Bank to fund farmers at a 4% interest rate. Now, I can't fund farmers to 4% interest rate. My cost of funding sits at 7%. I can do it as a CSI initiative, but I can't do it as a commercially sustainable business model because I'll be out of and Bennie will phone me very quickly and say I'm breaching my prudential ratios. And those are the risks that banks face on a continuous basis. The Nafisa was also a government grant scheme that enabled farmers to get funding at a cheaper rate with a bit of support structures built around that. But if you don't complete the land component, the infrastructure component, the subsidized funding component, the skills and training component, and access to a value chain, we are going to battle to get this.
You know what I love about the banking industry is the terminology you use. So you talk about this thing called the loss absorption capability. So basically what you're saying is that if things go tits up, okay, basically the government's got to step in and help, and you'll wash your hands of it.
And it sounds simplistic, but if we had a drought in the Western Cape 2016, 2017, 2018, suddenly the losses that the farmers incurred grew exponentially. If I'm a bank and I've advanced funding, I'll have to take the losses because the farmer can't repay me. Banks have certain, and if I say loss absorption, you can only absorb so many losses before you start getting financially
because you're a business, I get
sustainable business. So where agricultural development globally is successful, there's a key government component of providing that loss absorption, whether it's through insurance structures or through capital injections and so forth. Because if we expect, and we can even take expropriation of that conversation as an example, if banks are expected to take losses because the mortgages they've registered, those farms are taken away and the farmers can no longer repay the banks. So banks will have to be recapitalized in some shape or form.
I get that. It's difficult. But really what's happening is that while government is throwing money at Eskom and SAA, this sector, John purchases, but getting the short end of the stick. Am I right?
Let's take the Land Bank as a key example. Yeah. The Land Bank is the government's agricultural development bank. Last time the Land Bank received any capital from government was in 2010. That's when we played Waka Waka and danced around in the streets. It's 10 years later, and now
good times, yeah.
The Land Bank is required to, from a funding perspective, be a commercial bank and raise expensive funding in the commercial market and fund higher risk development assets. I mean the observation was made previously that we want a social result with a commercial initiative. And these two are unfortunately very difficult to get together and make that successful.
All right. What I'm going to do now, because I see our time is up, I'm going to ask you, John, to reply to that. Yeah. But I also want you to make a closing statement, if you would, in answer to this question, is that I've heard a lot of talk here, a lot of frustration. And this is a question to all of you as I come to you, what's the quick win? What's the quick fix?
Okay. Just firstly back on Bennie's situation, I happened to serve on the board of Land Bank too for a few years and was actually there when he was appointed there. And he's absolutely right. The Land Bank is in a quandary to be a development bank. And it actually played more in the commercial space than in development. The problem is, and we've been working with government since 2008 to develop what we call a blended finance model where they basically subsidize interest rates so that you can get to the 4% interest rates. If we don't get those blended finance models, cost of capital is too expensive for the developing farmer. So there are a different set of mechanisms that we must bring in, incentives and to help them. But it's not just finance, it's the skills, it's the technology, it's the markets, it's the infrastructure, the roads to get to some of these areas, for example, in the Old Transkei, is very difficult. So it's a whole package of rural development that if you want to unlock those areas in the Eastern Cape, KZN, Limpopo, that one dealer referred to earlier, we've got to invest there before you're going to get a return. I just don't think... Well, government doesn't have the means at the moment to really make those investments. It's got higher priorities economically that it has to address. Eskom is one. And that's why they've run out of bank guarantees for the Land Bank. And that's why Moody's downgraded the Land Bank recently, is because they understand that the government can't extend guarantees to the Land Bank. So the Land Bank is in a really tough situation at the moment.
So the status quo effectively remains the same.
No. What I do see is that private sector is coming up with development models. Agri. is seeing that there's a failure in the development sector. And our development is especially the smallholders and emerging farmers, etc. So I think that the initiative is right, that private sector try and pick that space up. But how can private sector then make finance cheaper and get the loss absorption models right? Because there are going to be losses there. It is higher risk. How do we manage that? I think that is going to be the challenge for AGDA. We should definitely support the initiative, but we're also going to have to see how it works best. So I think private sector is already picking up on this deficiency in the market.
So there's a sliver of light that I'm hearing.
There's a sliver of light.
Jeff, some closing remarks from you. Again, what would constitute or construe a quick fix for you here?
Viewpoint here, we have differing views on land. I don't enter that debate. I'm sitting with 12,000 hectares of high potential irrigation land. I can't find a cent to develop it. So that's the one issue. But we've solved the training issue. We've solved the marketing issue. We've solved all the support service issues. The glaring missing link is, how do I fund state-owned land?
Okay. Kobus, aside from solving my avocado problem.
It's not solved yet, sorry.
Well, we're getting there, okay?
For us, the low-hanging fruit is the strength of our commercial farmers at the moment. I mean, they're the best in the world. If you put what a commercial farmer faces in this country in any of the first world countries, he will be the leader farmer. So they've got the skills, they've got the infrastructure, and we just need to connect them with our smaller scale farmers. And I think that's a quick win for us.
Okay.
Fully agree.
Bennie?
We all have a role to play in creating and growing the agricultural space. For all of us that represents a component in the end-to-end value chain, we all have to take some pain and take some risks. But it requires a combined effort from each and everyone, as opposed to individual initiatives.
Okay, Brenda?
For me, because I'm a player in both industry, one, the agricultural sector, number two, the technology industry. So I have full appreciation of how one can bring about the two sides together. I am part of, we giving the inputs as well in terms of the master plan as to talking about transformation, especially for women and youth inclusion. If you don't take care of this part of the economy or the players like women development, youth participation in the sector, we might as well stop talking. Secondly, we are now going as African Farmers Association into full digital transformation, where we're saying, okay, banks, we've been knocking at your doors for too long, nothing is happening. Now we need to start appreciating technology and innovation in the sense of, you say you can't finance us because you don't know who we are. So profiling of our farmers is at the core of everything. Where it includes different components. One talks to mentoring and evaluation. It talks to introducing weather-based index insurance. It talks to access to market. It talks to the water issue as well. It talks to also bringing in the big corporates to say, your CSI funds, are we able to unlock those as well for development? And it, yeah.
It's a long list.
Infrastructure comes to play as well. And we need to now start appreciating that even if we don't get any much help here, we'll go outside of our borders. We now need to start thinking forward about the Continental Trade Agreement. What does it do? Everyone is looking at us to say, we need to take the lead. Are we there yet in terms of our thinking if we are still battling with these issues of farmer-driven developmental model that will talk to unlocking that
Okay. Brenda, Tlhabane, thank you.
The finance.
Jeff, I meant to tell you, by the way, the fourth one. So we've got the master plan, we've got the task team, the Commission of Inquiry, and we've also got the War Room. Don't forget the War Room. Very important. You can always develop policy in the War Room. Pragnesh Desai from Galileo, let's get some closing remarks from you.
Yes, I think I agree with everything that everyone has said. I think just speaking on Brenda's point, again, I come back to the credit manager, right? That this application is in front of this credit manager. How does he or she know whether this farmer, will grow these crops? So I think another thing we need to look at, so we agree with the land, water, all of that, is maybe some sort of certification, some sort of paper or skills audit or something that tells the credit manager that's fine. He doesn't have the land, but he's got a contract. He's got water. He knows how to grow these crops and sell it. Why? Because we have seen that he's been certified and he's mentored. All of these kind of things needs to now start coming into, where somebody's passion again meets the credit manager.
And just a reminder to everyone, you're not in the banking industry. And Johann, a final word from you, and I've left you until last because ultimately none of this is going to be achieved unless technology becomes more accessible and more inexpensive. But really, you do hold the future in your hand, don't you?
Absolutely, Jeremy. And I think I was listening to each and every of these panelists. They all have they've got a plan, but there's one word that I would like to basically put on the table, and that's collaboration. So with the collaboration effect that could be unlocked through these different ecosystems, ranging from the small-scale farmer to the retailer to the commercial farmer, I think that's the only way that we can actually collaborate on this potential issue and work our way through digitization and optimization of processes going forward.
All right. Brenda, I promise you, next time there will be more women on this panel. Not all these old men that you've...
We are there in terms of lobbying and policy advocacy to make sure that we have a system that is inclusive in terms of farmers in the mainstream. We do that naturally. So,
good. Panel members, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great pleasure.